All right, everybody out there, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens. This is the San Francisco Dharma Collective, and tonight we're going to read another sutta. We're picking right up where we left off 2 weeks ago. We're diving back into the Middle Length Discourses. We're moving on to Sutta number 96, the Esukārī Sutta, the teaching given to the Brahmin Esukārī. So if you'll remember, many weeks ago, we moved into a new section of the Majjhima Nikāya. We've been working with a bunch of different sutras that are all teachings given to Brahmins. And we've noticed that there's a theme to all of these sutras, and we're going to revisit a theme tonight. This sutta tonight, the Esukārī Sutra, it's another one where we're going to be focused on the caste system, or what is known as the caste system. But where we have a lot of interesting things to talk about, and I think a lot of just a lot that I think is very relevant to the world that we live in today. So, um, yeah, so that's it. That's where we're going. Um, yeah, this is going to be our sixth of 10 suttas to the Brahmins. So we've already done five. We're about halfway through. And again, this is going to be an interesting one tonight. Um, well, without any further ado, let's dive in. So, thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One, the Bhagavan, by the way, and I'm going to mention that tonight. The Blessed One is this word Bhagavan. So pay attention to that. Thus have I heard on one occasion the Bhagavan, the Blessed One, was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then the Brahmin Esukārī went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk had finished, he sat down at one side and he said, Master Gautama, the Brahmins prescribe 4 levels of service, 4 levels of paricharya, of service. They prescribe the level of service given towards Brahmins, the level of service towards a kshatriya, towards a noble, the level of service towards a vaishya, towards a merchant, and the level of service towards a shudra, a worker. So really quickly, let's clarify the topic. There's going to be 2 questions tonight. Or the Brahmin Esukārī is going to have 2 questions for the Buddha. The first question is about this idea of paricharya, what is going to be translated as service. But even before we get into it, because they're not really going to define service, so I want to kind of clarify. The idea of service is we are thinking about like like an attendant, like a maid or a butler. But what we need to understand, because this is kind of an old world idea, to serve somebody, it could be that you are bringing them something. It could be actually that you're feeding them. And this is like a very common practice in India to actually hand feed other people. So this is like important to understand that it's a part of the culture that you would potentially serve somebody food with your own hands. And they're not going to mention it, but I also want you to know that Interestingly, the word to serve can also have, excuse me, can also have like sexual undertones. A, a lot like in English, actually. We use that same language in English to serve somebody. So all of those are actually at play. So it could be anything. It could be kind of in any capacity. That's what we're talking about is serving somebody. So Esukārī goes to the Buddha and says, the Brahmins say that there's four kinds of service. Service to Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Now, in this framework, he says, Master Gotama, the Brahmins, the priests, the priestly caste, the Brahmins prescribe this as the level of service to a Brahmin. A merchant may serve a Brahmin. A Kshatriya may serve a Brahmin. And a Shudra may serve a Brahmin. So everybody can serve a Brahmin. A Brahmin may serve a Brahmin. A Kshatriya may serve a Brahmin, a merchant or a Vaishya may serve a Brahmin, and a Shudra may serve a Brahmin. That is the level of service towards a Brahmin, which the Brahmins prescribe. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the level of service towards a Kshatriya warrior or a Kshatriya noble person. A Kshatriya, a noble person, may serve a Kshatriya noble person. A Vaishya merchant may serve a Kshatriya noble person, and a Shudra may serve a Kshatriya noble person. This is the level of service towards a Kshatriya noble which the Brahmins prescribe. So, Kshatriya to Kshatriya, Vaishya to Kshatriya, Shudra to Kshatriya, but not a Brahmin to a Kshatriya. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the level of service towards a Vaishya, towards a merchant. A merchant may serve another merchant, and a Shudra worker may serve a merchant. But no Kshatriya or Brahmin can serve a merchant. That's the level of service towards a merchant, which, of course, the Brahmins prescribe. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the level of service towards a Shudra, a worker. Only a Shudra worker may serve a Shudra worker. For who else could serve a Shudra worker? This is the level of service towards a worker which the Brahmins prescribe. What does Master Gotama say about all of this? So before we hear the Buddha's response to all of this is a big question to be asking the Buddha. So what do you think about all of this hierarchy and social structure that we have going on here? By the way, I want to remind you all that this attitude towards the Varna, towards the caste system, it is still alive and well. And this has a lot to do in India with who gets married to who. It has a lot to do with if you go to a communal event, it has to do with who you sit next to, who you don't sit next to. And it can get pretty serious. And what I mean is that it gets to the point in India where you don't even touch somebody that is of a lower caste than you, in some circles, in some places. So this system that the Brahmin is asking the Buddha about, this is serious. This is like very much of like this is the societal structure of India that was alive and well at the time of the Buddha. And again, it's still going on today. So, what does the Buddha have to say about this? Excuse me. Well, Brahmin, has all the world authorized the Brahmins to prescribe these four levels of service? So, in other words, does the whole world see it this way? And Esukārī replies, no, Master Gotama. And then the Buddha says this. This is the Buddha's first super interesting reply to all of this. He says, suppose, Brahman, suppose that someone were to force a really nice cut of meat onto a poor, penniless, destitute person, and then tell that person, you have to eat this, and then pay me for it. So too, without the consent of those other recluses and Brahmins, the Brahmins nevertheless prescribe those four levels of service. So that would be, in modern terms, right? That would be like somebody giving you a car and then telling you you're late on the payments. But wait a minute. I didn't ask for your car. I didn't want your car. So how can you give me the car and then expect me to pay for it? That's the analogy of it's like somebody giving somebody a really nice cut of meat and then saying, now fork up. That's what the Buddha says is like when the Brahmins decide for everybody else that this is the way things are going to go. So, first of all, the whole world doesn't agree to it. And second of all, not even the other castes agreed to this. This is just something sort of being put on them by the Brahmins. So, in section 5, paragraph 5, the Buddha says, I do not say, Brahman, that all are to be served, nor do I say that none are to be served. For if, when serving someone, one becomes worse and not better because of that service, then I say that person should not be served. And if, when serving someone, one becomes better and not worse because of that service, then I say that they should be served. Ah, so now this is the Buddha. So some traditions would have it that nobody be served, that nobody should, in a way, be below anybody else in that sense and serve anybody else. The Buddha says, though, I don't say that. So I don't say that everybody should be served, and I don't say that nobody should be served. He says, rather, you should serve somebody if they get better because of it. And if you serve somebody and they get worse, that's bad service. That shouldn't be done. So the Buddha's laying out his criteria for paricharya, for this idea of service. And we see this often. We see service going on in the sutras, where maybe a king will hand feed the Buddha and the monks, or maybe one of the monks will feed somebody. But the point is that there is service still going on, but not in a hierarchical caste-based way. So, if someone were to ask a noble, so if somebody were to ask a kshatriya, which of these people, which of these should you serve? One in whose service you become worse and not better when serving them? or one in whose service you become better and not worse when serving them? Answering rightly, a noble Kshatriya would answer like this, saying, I should not serve the one in whose service I become worse and not better when serving them. I should serve someone in whose service I become better and not worse when serving them. And if somebody were to ask a Brahmin or a Vaishya merchant or a Shudra worker, who should you serve? Somebody that when you serve them, you get worse? Or somebody that when you serve them, you get better? Well, each of those, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra, when asked, they would say, I should not serve the one in whose service I become worse and not better when serving them. I should serve the one in whose service I become better and not worse when serving them. So we started with the idea of the person being served, getting better or getting worse. And then the Buddha says that's the criteria for service. And then the other way around. You doing the serving. Are you getting better? Like maybe perhaps more virtuous or something like that? Are you improving or are you getting worse? That's the criteria that any member of the caste, any caste member would agree that that makes sense. All right. Now the Buddha introduces a couple of new ideas. He says, I do not say, Brahmin, that one is better because one is from an aristocratic family. Oh, but wait, nor do I say that one is worse because one is from an aristocratic family. I do not say that one is better because one is of great beauty, nor do I say that one is worse because one is of great beauty. I do not say that one is better because one is of great wealth, nor do I say that one is worse because one is of great wealth. So the Buddha introduces these three ideas of being born in an aristocratic family, being beautiful, or being wealthy. And it's important from a Buddhist point of view. I think it's really important to notice that the Buddha says, yeah, I don't say that one is better because they're from a fancy family or because they're beautiful or because they're rich. Now, some traditions might say that those people are worse off. But the Buddha says, but I don't say they're worse off either. I don't say it's bad to be born in an aristocratic family, or if you're beautiful, you're cursed, or if you're wealthy, you're cursed. I don't say that. For here, he says, for here, Brahmin, somebody from an aristocratic family, they might kill living beings. They might take what has not been given. They might misconduct themselves in their sensual pleasures. They might speak falsely, or speak maliciously, or speak harshly, or gossip. They might be covetous. They might have a mind of ill will. They might hold wrong views. Therefore, I don't say that one is better just because one is from an aristocratic family. Oh, but also, Brahman, somebody from an aristocratic family, they might abstain from killing living beings. They might abstain from taking what has not been given. They might abstain from misconduct in their sensual pleasures. They might abstain from false speech, from malicious speech, harsh speech, and from gossip. They may not be covetous. They might be uncovetous. They might have a mind that has no ill will, and they might hold the right view. Therefore, I don't say that one is worse because one is born from an aristocratic family. And the Buddha will go on and say the same exact thing. He says here, there's a Brahmin who is of great beauty, or there's a Brahmin of great wealth. And he says, I don't say whether they're better worth because they might kill living beings. They might take what has not been given. They might basically break the 10 precepts in that way, or the 10 wholesome actions. So I don't say that they're better just because they're in one of those castes, because they might perform one of those 10 unwholesome actions. But each of those people, they might abstain from killing living beings, abstain from taking what has not been given. In other words, abstain from the 10 unwholesome actions. And that's why I don't say that they're worse, because they might be moral in that sense. Therefore, I do not say, Brahman, that all are to be served, nor do I say that none are to be served. For if, when serving someone, one's faith, virtue, learning, generosity, and wisdom increase in their service, then I say that they should be served. All right, so this is where the Buddha finally says, this is what I'm defining as improving or getting better from service. And remember, this is going both ways. It's either on the part of the person being served or on the part of the person doing the serving. And the Buddha is saying that his criteria for whether that service is like valuable or is like good service in that way, it's about whether or not that service increases faith, virtue, learning, generosity, and wisdom. So, shraddha, shila, shrutam, an interesting new word for me called chago or chaga. We'll talk about chaga, generosity, in a moment. And then finally, prajna or panna, wisdom. So this is a curious little list of 5. It has a lot of overlap with other lists of 5, but it's kind of its own list of 5. I think this is actually a good moment to pause to sort of talk about how a lot of these lists come about. So we're familiar with all of these lists that the Buddha kind of teaches in, 5 aggregates or the 5. These are similar, but not exactly the same as the 5 faculties, the 5 spiritual faculties. So what we kind of need to know, or what I think is helpful to know, is that the Buddha didn't exactly like teach in lists. I mean, he did teach in lists, but he doesn't really teach in that way where he's like, let me teach you the list of the 5 spiritual faculties. No, he teaches and he uses lists. And then what happens is that after the Buddha passes away and the Sangha starts to formulate what is called the Abhidharma, they start going through all of the sutras and they start identifying these repeated lists that the Buddha taught in. And so then they become these matrika, these lists of the teachings. But it's kind of important to recognize that the Buddha just said what he said and spoke in these lists in that way. But the listifying of them, or the listification, or whatever you want to call it, is kind of after the fact. And we can kind of notice that a list like this it never made it as a list, right? It was just sort of like, to my knowledge, this is the only sutra where these 5 occur this way. And so it just never became the list of the 5, whatever, the 5 results of good service, or, something like that, right? But we did it tonight. We made our own. These are the 5 results of good service. So again, let's quickly go through them. It'll be important for the second part of the sutra to have a foundation of these. So Shraddha, we talk about a lot, but I want to remind you, faith here is really specifically like faith in the Dharma, like faith in Buddhism, but it's a really subtle idea that I want us to kind of, again, moving forward tonight, I want us to have this. It's about this, a way of like looking at, you could call it even maybe like pessimism. They would call it doubt. But what I mean is that, the Buddha's talking about, or Buddhism is talking about alleviating your suffering. And there's a way in which if you don't believe that that's possible at all, like if you don't think Buddhism will work, it won't work. Like they even, they call these things hindrances. They call doubt a blockage or a hindrance, a nivaranya. And the idea is that it is exactly that. It's a blockage from the very thing. And so we are looking here to the performing of a kind of a service in which the performance of that service increases your like your confidence and your belief in that this is going to work, that this Buddhism stuff is actually effective in that way. And I believe it is. And in fact, and I'm just kind of speaking hypothetically now, the idea is like, and I have been in the service of a teacher for a year, let's say. Again, I'm speaking hypothetically, but let's say I have now been in service to a teacher and I've either been giving them dana or giving them actual offerings. And a year later, my confidence and my faith in Buddhism has grown. I have become even more confident that the end of suffering is at the end of this path. That would be a form of service where one's shraddha has increased, right? Where your confidence in all of this has gotten more. Whereas you could imagine you study with somebody for a year and they're like not a very enlightened person, and you walk away and you're like, I just wasted a year of my life servicing this total jerk. I don't think this Buddhism stuff works at all because this guy's an idiot. That would be service in which Shraddha was diminishing and decreasing in that way. So again, hypothetical scenario, but Shila, morality. This sutra, of course, is very much about Shila or morality. That's what we're talking about in terms of the 10 wholesome actions. This idea of abstaining from taking life, abstaining from taking what has not been given, abstaining from abusing sensual pleasures, and so on and so forth. So the Buddha's criteria for so many things is about morality. And so now the question is does your service increase those 10 wholesome actions? Does it increase your commitment to your moral practice? So that's a question. Shrutam is learning. Shruta literally means to hear, right? So it's about listening, learning, hearing about the Dharma. Again, the learning is about after a year of service to this person, have I learned a lot? Have I increased in my learning? And then I wanted to quickly mention this fourth one. So it's a new word to me, C-A-G-A, chaga. What's interesting about this word, I want to share this with everybody really quickly. So this is a little aside, a little side quest, a little etymological side quest. So as I've mentioned many, many times, there is a version of the Middle Length Discourses. So there's a version of the entire Majjhima Nikāya in Chinese. And it dates from actually the early third century. It's like very old. And I've mentioned this in Dharma Doors several times because what's interesting is that in India, there's the time of the Buddha. And then, as we all know, after the time of the Buddha, Buddhism begins to sort of spread all over India, south and north. And that northern type of Buddhism, which eventually goes into like Afghanistan, from that area, it it kind of all gets turned into Sanskrit rather than Pali, which is happening in the southern part of India. And then those Sanskrit Buddhist texts go over to China in the third century, or at least beginning actually in the first century of the Common Era. And they start getting translated into Chinese, especially these in the third century. Meanwhile, the southern form of Buddhism is migrating to the southern tip of India, then migrating to Sri Lanka, the little island off the southern tip, then migrating over to Thailand and Burma. And then there, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, meaning from the separation, all of this gets sort of translated or at least written down in a variety of scripts, all in the Pali language, all in the Pali language, but written in different scripts, like different writing systems all throughout Southeast Asia. And so these two different lineages, the northern Sanskrit-based lineage and the southern Pali-based lineage, when they separated, they never came back together. So today I was reading this version, which is coming from the Pali, right? And I came to that interesting fourth of five terms. So I go to my Pali and I'm thinking chaga. I've never seen this word before. So I go looking in my Pali dictionary and I find out that it's a term for generosity. It's a kind of a term for being kind and generous in that way. And I go, oh, okay, interesting. But then I decided to translate this afternoon the Chinese version of this sutra. And so I went through, translated, because I've been in this big translating kick lately. I've just been doing a lot of it. So it's kind of very easy for me at this moment. And so I decided, oh, let me translate this sutra. First of all, I'm always telling everybody this. I was blown away at how close these are. Meaning the one that we're reading and then this Chinese translation, it's really wild. Line for line for line, they are so similar. And I don't just mean similar, I mean verbatim, the exact same text. So that's kind of reassuring from a certain point of view. But then what's interesting is that when I got to this line in the Chinese, I recognized the Chinese characters for faith, or the Chinese character for faith, Chinese characters for Shila, for learning. And then there was an interesting two Chinese character combination of two really weird Chinese characters that I'd never seen before. And I was like, what are those characters? And then, of course, the last character is the character for wisdom, or pranya. So I take the two Chinese mysterious characters and I start doing all of my linguistic research, and I immediately realize, this is a transliteration, meaning these Chinese characters, what they mean, like what they symbolically mean, is not part of this. They must be only being used for their sound. Is what makes them transliterations. And I immediately noticed that the first character translates as cha. And if you remember, the Pali word that I didn't know that I looked up was chaga. And wouldn't you know it, the second Chinese character is pronounced ga. So it was a Chinese transliteration of the word chaga, which is the word I didn't know in Pali. And I found it very interesting that in the Chinese, they decided to transliterate it. They could have easily translated it, but they decided to actually keep the phonetic quality of it. But again, what is interesting is that these two versions of this text, separated by thousands of years, are word for word the same, even down to transliterating the exact term. So I just wanted to share that with everybody as a little background on this interesting Pali term chaga for generosity. Questions about that? Yeah, I thought that might raise a question. Yeah, no.
I'm trying to think. I'm sure you thought about this, but you haven't said anything about it. Like, when are things transliterated? Like, what does that tell us about the word? Is it a rare word, or is it a word that we don't want to translate because its meaning is so subtle in the original language? Like
Yep,
we say "dana" sometimes when we're talking about
yep,
velocity. And there's a reason for that, right?
yep.
What do you think is the reason?
I mean, this is very much part of like the in my PhD work, or my interest in that was that kind of cultural translation. So my research revealed to me that it's so fascinating that just like in English, as Buddhism is being translated into English starting in the late 1800s, but then, kicking up really after World War II, things really kick into gear. And there's certain words, the main one that, of course comes to mind is nirvana.
Mm,
A nirvana, it could be translated, but in English, you never see it translated. It
mm,
is always just Nirvana, to the point where it has become an English word, even the name of a band, right?
mhm,
Well, the same thing was happening in China and Chinese, where certain words were understood to be really important Buddhist words that were deemed beyond translation.
mhm.
Basically they just start to become part of the Chinese vocabulary, just like a lot of these Buddhist words have become part of our vocabulary. So when a word is in transliterated, you kind of know you really have two options.
Mhm.
And yeah, you kind of get trained to notice these differences, but one option is the one I was just referring to, that it's a very technical word that to translate it, you would miss it. So we're just going to keep it as what it is.
Mhm.
The other one is where you get into mantras and the more magical stuff, where the sound of the word is considered to be its potency. And so you don't translate it. But but mantras are not technical terms. They are
Oh,
just like chants in that way, or hymns. So they are just fully transliterated. Yeah.
so to you, it seems like this would be in the first category then.
That it would it especially in this list, it jumps out as a highly technical term. Or not, I wouldn't say highly technical, but just a technical term. That, yeah, awesome. All right. So let's keep going because we're about to get to the real important part. So that's the end of the first question. The first question is all about paricharya, this idea of service, and the Brahmin idea that service is very regulated versus the Buddha's idea of like it's all depends about whether those five things are being increased or decreased. So whether faith and moral discipline, if those things are being increased. All right. Now let's get to the second question, because this is really what I think the sutra is all about. So when this was said, the Brahmin Esukārī said to the Blessed One, Master Gautama, The Brahmins prescribe four types of wealth. They prescribe the wealth of a Brahmin. They prescribe the wealth of a kshatriya, a noble one, the wealth of a vaishya, a merchant, and the wealth of a shudra, a worker. Therein, Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the wealth of the Brahmin. Wandering for alms, begging for food. That's the Brahmin's wealth. Now, a Brahmin who disregards or spurns their own wealth, meaning their ability to wander and beg for alms, a Brahmin who disregards that abuses his duty like a guard who takes what has not been given. This is the wealth of a Brahmin, which the Brahmins prescribe. I'm going to keep going, but we're going to come back to that. But I want you to hear what the other wealths are, and then we'll come back to the Brahmin wealth and why, how is that wealth? So that's the wealth of the Brahmin. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the wealth of the kshatriya, the noble warrior caste, the bow and the arrow, or the bow and the quiver. Now, a noble warrior, a kshatriya, who spurns his own wealth, the bow and quiver, abuses his duty like a guard who takes what has not been given. This is the wealth of a noble kshatriya, which the Brahmins prescribe. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the wealth of the Vaishya merchant class, farming and cattle breeding. A merchant who spurns or neglects his own wealth, farming and cattle breeding that is, abuses his duty like a guard who takes what has not been given. That's the wealth of the Vaishya merchant class, which the Brahmins prescribe. Master Gotama, the Brahmins prescribe this as the wealth of the Shudra worker, the sickle and the carrying pole. A worker who spurns his own wealth, the sickle and the carrying pole, abuses his duty like a guard who takes what has not been given. That is the wealth of a worker, which the Brahmins have prescribed. What does Master Gotama have to say about all that? All right, so there's a couple of important things going on here. First thing, so we have the wealth, but wealth for a Brahmin versus a Kshatriya versus a Vaishya versus a Shudra. And I think we're pretty clear about like the wealth of a Shudra is having tools in that way, having, if they're a worker, having, right, a sickle and a shoulder yoke, right, a carrying pole. So that makes sense. The Vaishyas, the merchant class, there's the ones that have all the cattle, they sell milk, they sell cheese, they sell all the stuff that's coming from their farm in that way. So they're the merchant class. That might also include textiles, by the way, like wool, things like that. So that's the merchants. That's their wealth, a farm. Now, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the bow and arrow, of course, that's their wealth. The Brahmin's wealth, it says, is wandering for alms. That's their wealth. And in the same way that if a Kshatriya warrior were to throw away his bow and arrow, that would be neglecting his duty. That would be throwing away his wealth. Well, a Brahmin, the wealth of a Brahmin is begging for alms. And this is subtle, but we just have to understand the role of the Brahmin in this whole social structure. And it's why I kind of keep, slipping in there that the Brahmins are the priestly class. So what it is a Brahmin, the Brahmin's wealth is that they're considered to be like uh, well, you know how like, it's funny. You know how people launder money? Like money that's been obtained in bad ways, it gets like laundered. Well, Brahmins are karma launderers. And basically the idea is that a Brahmin is considered a special being, a special member of the system. And again, this is according to the Brahmins. But the Brahmins are considered special, like in terms of their spirituality or their karma. And what it is that their wealth is their ability to sort of transmute people's karma and their merit. And so if you give me, like if I'm a Brahmin and you give me offerings, I go around begging for food and you give me offerings, that's good for you. But if a worker dude were to come ask you for money and you gave him money, it would be basically wasting your money because they're an impure being. Whereas the Brahmins consider themselves pure beings. And therefore, when they beg for food, their ability to do that is their wealth in that sense. And so a Brahmin who has the ability to launder people's karma and they don't do that, then that's wasting their wealth in that sense. Now, don't get it twisted in that sense. The Brahmins become very wealthy in the traditional sense by performing their duties as priests, right? So their wealth, they are very wealthy, but they get that way by begging for alms in that sense. It seems contradictory, I know, but that's what's going on. Now, the really important part of this whole section is the language about if somebody, like if a kshatriya throws their bow and arrow away, or if a shudra throws their sickle away, it's abusing their duty. Just like somebody who's supposed to be guarding the stuff, but they steal it, basically, right? So what I want you to know is that what's being spoken about here, um, abusing one's duty or not, I want you to know that this topic is the topic of the famous Bhagavad Gita. It's why I mentioned about the Buddha being the Bhagavan, because Bhagavan or Bhagavad is like the Lord, the honored one. Now, it's used in Buddhism, it's used as a title for the Buddha, but in Hinduism in general, Bhagavan is God, is like the Lord in that way. Now, I'm mentioning the Bhagavad Gita because the Bhagavad Gita is the story of Arjun, the Kshatriya warrior, and the whole Bhagavad Gita, the whole story, is about Arjun or Arjuna the warrior who's gone to battle but starts to have doubts about being a warrior and basically is considering throwing away his bow and arrow. He's considering becoming a pacifist. And if you kind of study the history of the Bhagavad Gita, it would definitely seem that the Bhagavad Gita is a response to Buddhism, or at least that's the way that I was taught it in graduate school, that it is very much a response to Buddhism, and it's very much a response to people neglecting their social duty. Buddhism was encouraging people to neglect their social duty, and basically give up on the caste system and come join the Sangha. Well, this is a story about a warrior who decides they don't want to be a warrior, they want to be a pacifist. And so their chariot driver reveals that they are Krishna, reveals that they are God. And the message of the Bhagavad Gita, if you've never read it, and by the way, if you've never read it and want to, this is a very good translation, the Edgerton translation, I think it's called. Yeah, Franklin Edgerton, very good translation. But if you read this, what Krishna, God, tells Arjuna is to not neglect your dharma, to not neglect your social duty. And so, what I want to kind of mention, I wanted to use this sutra tonight. So, this is Esukārī, the Brahmin. He is talking about the idea that is espoused in the Bhagavad Gita, which is that a member of the caste system has a duty to fulfill in that place. And therefore, if they don't do their duty, they are neglecting their dharma. So that is the kind of the message of the Bhagavad Gita, and it gets sort of modernized in terms of every individual finding their personal dharma, their personal, like your unique place in this society, and then fulfilling your life's duty, the responsibility to your life in that way. So that's what's being spoken about here. So there's a conversation going on about wealth, but wealth as it pertains to Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. And then there's this introduction of this idea of neglecting or kind of throwing away your wealth, neglecting your duty, abusing your duty in that sense. So that's the question now. The second question Esukārī has is, all right, Buddha, we have this caste system, and each member of the caste system gets, has a different wealth. What do you think about all this? And the Buddha says, well, Brahmin, once again, has the entire world authorized the Brahmins to prescribe these four kinds of wealth? And Esukārī, of course, has to admit, no, Master Gotama, right? The whole world has not authorized the Brahmins to think this way. And then once again, the Buddha says, well, suppose, Brahman, that they were to force a cut of meat upon a poor, penniless, destitute person and tell them, you have to eat this meat and then pay me for it. So too, without the consent of those other recluses and Brahmins, the Brahmins have nevertheless prescribed these four types of wealth. All right, everybody okay with all that caste system Brahmin stuff? Well, now this is what the Buddha says. So he refutes that idea like he did the other one. But now he says this. I, Brahman, I declare the noble, supermundane Dharma as a person's own wealth. So that's the theme of the sutra tonight. That while the Brahmins have their wealth and the Kshatriyas have their bows and arrows, the Buddha says, I'm teaching, I'm declaring the noble, world transcending wealth that is basically available to everybody. All right, so that's that idea. So I declare the Arya Lokotara Dharma, the noble out of this world Dharma, as a person's own wealth. Now, he adds, though, and this is where I mentioned this when we first started studying the Brahmaṇavagga, the section on the Brahmins. I mentioned this earlier. The Buddha doesn't necessarily call for the destruction of the caste system. He says what he has to say about it, but he follows up. So he says, I declare the noble world transcending Dharma. But, he says, recollecting his ancient or somebody's, recollecting somebody's ancient maternal and paternal family lineage, they are reckoned according to wherever they're born or reborn. If they are reborn in a clan of nobles, then that person is reckoned to be a noble kshatriya. If a person is born in the clan of Brahmins, they are reckoned as a Brahmin. If they're reborn in the clan of merchants, they are reckoned to be a merchant. If they are reborn in a clan of Shudra workers, they are reckoned to be a Shudra worker. Just like fire is reckoned by the particular condition dependent upon which it burns. When fire burns dependent upon logs, it's called a log fire. When fire burns dependent upon twigs, it's called a twig fire. When fire burns dependent on grass, it's reckoned as a grass fire. When fire burns dependent on cow dung, it's reckoned to be a cow dung fire. So too, Brahman, I declare the noble supermundane Dharma as a person's own wealth. But recollecting their ancient maternal and paternal lineage, they are reckoned according to wherever they are reborn. If they're reborn as a Brahmin, and so on and so forth. All right. So that's where the Buddha says, yeah, people are going to say what they're going to say. And if somebody is born in the family of a Brahmin, everybody's going to call them a Brahmin. And what he's saying is, that has nothing to do with me. That's what society says. So I'm over here teaching the noble world transcending Dharma as the true wealth for people. But I can't help if people are recognized by the family they're born in. All right. That makes sense to everybody, that part? Now, I want to talk about this noble world transcending Dharma, of course. That's what we've come to talk about. So let's dive a little deeper. So the Buddha says, if Brahmin, if anyone from a clan of noble kshatriyas, if any member of the kshatriya clan goes forth from the home life into homelessness, and after encountering the Dharma and the discipline proclaimed by the Tathagata, they abstain from killing living beings, they abstain from taking what has not been given, they abstain from incelibacy, they abstain from false speech, malicious speech, harsh speech, and gossip, and they are uncovetous, have a mind without ill will, and they hold the right view, then they are one who is accomplishing the true way, the Dharma that is wholesome. And if a Brahmin or anyone from a clan of Brahmins goes forth from the home life into homelessness, or if anybody from a clan of merchants goes forth from the home life into homelessness, or if anybody from the worker Shudra class goes forth from home life into homelessness, and after encountering the Dharma and the discipline proclaimed by the Tathagata, they abstain from killing living beings, abstain from taking what has not been given, abstain from incelibacy, abstain from false speech, malicious speech, harsh speech, and gossip. They are uncovetous, have a mind without ill will, and they hold the right view, then that person is accomplishing the true way, the Dharma that is wholesome. Okay, so that's our description of the true way. Basically, upholding the 10 wholesome dharmas in that sense. So before we get to the kind of the ending of this, Yeah, because the ending of this is a lot of stuff that we've seen in other sutras recently. So I just want to focus on this last, like this important idea of like wealth. So I was excited to do this sutra for a few reasons. One, actually, is I've actually been looking for a sutra like this that talks about this sort of this other idea of dharma, meaning it's tr the translation. One translation of dharma in kind of a Hindu context is duty, one's duty, and this is a sutra that basically uses that more traditional idea of dharma versus or in contradistinction to the Buddhist idea of dharma. And one of the things we want to recognize is, first of all, the universality of Buddhism. That Buddhism is truly a kind of a Catholic in that sense, a universal tradition. And what it means is, do you have sensory organs? All right, then this message is for you. So this is not about being a Brahmin or a Shudra. It's not about being Chinese or English or American or what have you. It's a universal message. So first of all, and then second of all, this sutra introduces this idea of, well, of wealth, but what it's really introducing is what I would call this a re-evaluation of value. It's kind of a Nietzschean way of thinking about it, but a re-evaluation of value. Like, what is wealth? And even though the sutra doesn't go too deep into it, it's about this idea of the Dharma, this noble, world transcending teaching as being way more valuable than a bow and an arrow and a sickle and all of those other things. That this Dharma, this teaching, is is a form of wealth. And of course, we cannot be thinking of it of like, and how can I translate this dharma into some bucks? Like, how can I get wealthy off of this dharma? No, 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 no. We're not talking about that kind of wealth, like money, property, and things like that. We're talking about, we're not even in many ways, we're not even talking about exactly wisdom. It's even beyond that that is the wealth. And I would say that the wealth is the liberation. The wealth is this freedom. And this idea that, a Buddhist has in that way of looking at certain, like, well, basically looking at belongings as kind of a trap, not as wealth, like as actually the opposite of wealth. Whereas, as I'm always saying, to not need anything, oh, that's wealthy. That's rolling in it in my book in that sense. So I just kind of wanted to share that. And by the way, I just want to it's not going to mention it. Yeah, it's not going to do it, but it might as well do it. So allow me to do it. So there's something that happens in the world of Buddhism. It has to do with wealth, actually. And it's something that you already know, but you might have missed it. What it is it's all of this talk about the three jewels, about the triple gem. Why do they call them jewels? Why do they call them gems? Because the Buddha, the teacher, the Dharma, the teachings, and this beautiful community, this is value. This is wealth. So the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, those are jewels. Rubies and emeralds and those things, they're impermanent like everything else. Whereas the teachings of the deathless, that's wealth. Like that's true wealth. So now hopefully you're like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's cool that it's this reevaluation of value where the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha are now the jewels. Well, if you're into that, if you're into this reevaluation of value, the Mahayana tradition, they love talking about jewels. In fact, they'll talk about a world full of jewels. And if you're not like on board with the subtle message that's going on, you might think the Mahayana people forgot the message. You might think that they all of a sudden got interested in gold and jewels again. No, they're talking about sanghas being everywhere. They're talking about that if you pay attention, every leaf of every tree is teaching the Dharma. Those are the jewels that they're talking about in those pure lands. So I just want you to know that all of this language of jewels in Buddhism is part of the reevaluation of value. Some people would prefer they just stop talking about jewels, but if you're on board with the way they're using language, it's really cool. So, all right. So I just wanted to slip that in there. Let's go ahead and finish this sutta up. So, what do you think, Brahmin? Is only a Brahmin capable of developing a mind of loving kindness towards a certain region without any hostility and without any ill will? And like not a kshatriya or a vaishya or a shudra, they can't develop loving kindness? And Esukārī the Brahmin says, no, Master Gotama. Whether it's a noble or a Brahmin or a merchant or a worker, everybody of those four castes is capable of developing a mind of loving kindness towards a certain region without any hostility, without any ill will. So too, Brahmin, if anyone from a clan of nobles were to go forth from home life and homeless life, abstain from killing, abstain from taking what has not been given, and so on and so forth, they are one who is accomplishing the true way, the Dharma that is wholesome. And what do you think, Brahmin? Is only a Brahmin capable of taking a loofah and bath powder, going to the river and washing off dust and dirt, and not a noble or a merchant or a worker? No, Master Gotama. Whether it be a noble or a Brahmin or a merchant or a worker, those of all four castes are capable of taking a loofah and bath powder and going to the river and washing off dust and dirt. So too, Brahmin, if anyone from any clan of nobles goes forth from home life into homelessness life and abstains from taking living life and abstains from taking what has not been given, they are one who is accomplishing the true way, the Dharma that is wholesome. And then one more, what do you think, Brahmin? Suppose a Abhishekad, a head anointed noble king, were to assemble here 100 men of different births from a bunch of different clans and told them all to go out and find, this is a quote from another sutra earlier, but the idea is that the king says to all these people, go find different wood and make a fire from different wood. And the question is, would the fires burn differently based, would the fire be different or the light of the fire be different? And the answer is no, for all fire has a flame, a color, and a radiance. And it is possible to use all fire for the purposes of fire. So too, Brahmin, if anyone from any clan of nobles goes forth from home life into homelessness, abstains from killing living beings, and so forth, they are one who is accomplishing the true way, the Dharma that is wholesome. And by the way, if you weren't here for some of these earlier suttas, that idea of what do you think? Um, can anybody from any caste, can they develop loving kindness towards a region? And the answer is yes. And then it's like, well, can anybody just go to the river and bathe? Can anybody make a fire? I pointed out earlier that what we're being walked through there, by the way, is sort of the career of a Brahmin, where they would perform a kind of a ritualized form of metta meditation, where they would do like what we would call shamatha, and get into a samadhi, generate loving kindness towards a region. Then they go purify their body, a kind of a baptismal thing of purifying the body. And then they would make the sacred homa fire and then perform some kind of Brahmanic ritual. So we were actually being walked through those stages of purification and the sacred fire. And the Buddha's basically saying, so only Brahmins can make a fire? Only Brahmins can get clean in a river? And so by Esukārī admitting, like, no, anybody from any caste can get clean and make a fire, the Buddha is pointing more to like then what's so special about the Brahmins in that way. And of course, when this was all said, the Brahmin Esukārī said to the Blessed One, Magnificent Master Gautama, magnificent Master Gautama. Master Gautama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as if putting upright would have been turned over, pointing the way to somebody who is lost, holding up a lamp in the dark. From today, let Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge, for life. All right. So, any questions, comments, or ideas pop up about this little Esukārī Sutra? Yeah, Robin.
Well, what about duty as versus wealth? A little bit more about what is the attraction, like maybe modern day, sort of the theme of duty.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny, or not funny, but interesting you should say that, Robin, because I wanted to like mention that even though we don't, at least in American culture, even though we don't have this caste system, we certainly do kind of have a caste system in a certain way, at least in terms of like upper class, lower class kind of situation like that. Now, fortunately, at least in American culture, we don't have the restrictions that they have in India in that way. But I do wanted to kind of address the question of duty in that sense. So I think for me, what is really important, it's kind of, I've come back to it now a few times. It's it's where the Buddha recognizes that this caste system, it has this sort of like social convention going on, which is that people are doing it, people are into it in that sense. And as I keep noting, I have yet to find a place where the Buddha sort of calls for the end of the caste system. It's not that he totally, supports it exactly, but he doesn't call for it to end. All he sort of does is say, if you're not into it, we're doing something else over here. And over here, it doesn't matter what caste you come from, meaning in the Sangha. So I think that that's kind of an important thing because, in other words, I don't think, and in fact, I don't, it's not about thinking. I can tell you a little bit, you know, Buddhism has, or at least even in the original days, in the old days, it it wasn't like there's we've even read a few sutras where the Buddha makes sure whoever's coming to join the Sangha that they've either like had their parents' permission, or there's just a way in which the Buddha doesn't want anybody actually neglecting their social duty, except he does because he's really encouraging people of leaving the home life. But the idea, though, is that insofar as society is concerned, the Buddhists kind of saying, yeah, there's like kind of conventional responsibilities to be had there, and they shouldn't be neglected in that way. But they shouldn't be, if I'm reading this sutra correctly, they shouldn't be understood as inherently, absolutely the case. Like one's, even taking, say, a classic example that a lot of people struggle with, which is sort of duty to one's parents. There, in some cultures, of course, it doesn't matter how nasty and terrible your parents are. You never should neglect that kind of filial duty in that sense. Whereas, of course, in the Buddhist tradition, it is okay in a certain sense to avoid being abused and to go join the monastery in that sense. So this is not a, again, absolute kind of a thing in that way. So I think a lot of this, in fact, what I just said, if we went back to the sutra, it's that question of, does serving this person make me better? Does serving this person make them better? And that idea of like, if I'm being like of service to my terrible parents and they're just utterly abusing me and making me worse and worse and worse, the way that I read this sutra is that that would be a bad form of service in that way. Whereas if being a good son or a good daughter to one's parents, and in doing that, you have grown and you've become more responsible and you've become kinder, then that's a good thing. So that was my quick answer about duty, to not shirk it entirely, but yeah. Yeah, Maria.
There we go. So thank you. I was, when we were talking about wealth, I was thinking about all the times I've heard contact with the Dharma called good fortune. And
Nice.
the other thing I just want to say is thank you for making the connection between, so when I first, especially in the context of Avatamsaka, um, the first time I was exposed to that, I remember being like, what is going on with the jewels on the trees? And
Mm.
I'm very tree focused to begin with. And then, so that's always kind of been a running question. And I never put that together until you said it tonight. So the connection between the jewels on the trees and the triple jewels, and every leaf is a teaching. And in that way, oh, so good. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. I'm happy when things spontaneously roll off the tongue like that. That's great. So any other questions, comments, or ideas? Yeah, no. Keep them coming.
Why do you think the Buddha doesn't just say, that the caste system is bad or wrong, or, is it like a skillful means, or is it like politically expedient? Well, I'm
Yeah.
just thinking,
Yeah.
like, I'm actually thinking about like, how could what could we learn from that for modern day politics? Not that I'm in politics, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
instead of sort of railing against systems, if instead we pointed to like, oh, this
Hmm.
is a better way to go or something. I don't know. Curious.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly something I've thought about, Noam, that's for sure. Um, my, tonight, right now, my feeling is, I feel like in so many ways, whoever this Buddha person was, pretty smart person in that way. and on many levels, right? And I think for me, the way that I see it is I think the Buddha, again, or whoever, really understood, in a way what the Chinese would call sort of the dynamics of yin and yang. And what I mean is there's a real reality to if you come directly at something with like heavy yang energy, you're going to get heavy yang energy directly back. It's sort of just part of the nature of the universe in that sense. And so I think my feeling is that the Buddha understood that if he were to come directly at attacking the caste system, that caste system would come directly back and attack them. So rather than doing that, I see it as like the image I have in my mind is the Buddha basically removing the support from underneath it by having all of these members, particularly of the lower castes and the higher castes, actually. Because remember, the Buddha was buddy buddy with a lot of kshatriyas and a lot of the, like Shariputra was a Brahmin. A lot of the early followers were either Brahmins or kshatriyas. And so I think by creating this third option or this other option, and by having a little release valve where the disenfranchised or just disaffected could leave that system, I think the Buddha's big vision was for that to just collapse rather than come at it to destroy it. Just remove what was holding it up. So now, obviously, the caste system in terms of India won and Buddhism sort of died out in that way. But in terms of like the world, Buddhism definitely dominated in that sense because the caste system did not spread out of India in that way. So yeah, that's my feeling, Noam.
Thank you. That's
Yeah.
great.
All right, everybody. We did another sutta. Excellent Sunday night. I'm going to call it. That'll be it. A couple of things. If you weren't able to make it to my day-long retreat last weekend at SFDC, it just got posted on YouTube. So the whole retreat, it's like 6 hours long. Noam did an amazing job putting like chapter titles. So you have like all the different sits are broken into chapters. So yeah, so it's up. So if you have the time, there's both the meditation sessions, but it's also a lot of great discussion, a lot of great questions and answers. So definitely check that out. Otherwise, I will be back next Sunday for the next sutta. I think we're going to move on to Sutta 97. So I hope you can make it next weekend for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks,
Sutra.
everybody.